Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first meeting of Humanities Combating Isolation. I'm extremely grateful for all of you for taking the time to be with us today, particularly amidst these difficult times, and yet excited to share your work. So I really hope that everyone is faring well, and really thank you very much for being here. Many of you know me, but still I am Maria Gonzalez Pendas, a fellow coordinator of the Public Humanities Initiative at Columbia University, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this new series, part of the online programming that the SOF Heyman Center for the Humanities is featuring in our new virtual reality, but also part of a longer commitment that the SOF Heyman has with promoting a public and civically engaged approach to humanistic work and teaching at Columbia, a commitment that it has with helping humanities helping humanities departments rethink who they talk to and how, and particularly, perhaps more urgently today, offering graduate students opportunities to expand their prospects beyond the traditional confines of academia. And I want to give a special note to Eileen Giluli, who I see there on the grid. Hi, Eileen. Who's quite a force in supporting this cause here at the SOF Heyman. We have put together this seminar to feature the projects developed by our 2019-2020 Public Humanities Graduate Student Fellows over the course of the past year, which will be followed by discussion with fellow scholars, community members, and civic partners with whom they have been working with. As most of you know, our Public Humanities Fellowship developed in collaboration with Humanities New York, who grants 2 graduate students a year from Columbia as part of their consortium fellowship program. And SOF Heyman has now this partner program, if you will, where we support and mentor additional 4 to 6 fellows each year. And I'm very grateful that Adam Capitano, hi Adam, Senior Program Officer of Humanities New York, is here as well. And I look forward to you being part of the conversation. As an interdisciplinary group of emerging scholars, our Public Humanities Fellows have worked both together and independently to implement projects that bridge humanistic thinking with civic engagement and social justice, scholarly research with public building and communication. In the following few weeks, they will discuss how their projects promote humanistic thinking beyond the university through a variety of media, such as audio and podcast producing, walking and mapping, and curatorial and pedagogical practices aimed at serving under-resourced communities. They will also discuss the origins of their projects in a commitment to break out of academic silos, the challenges they faced in the recent foreclosure of public spheres, and their current thinking about the methods and urgency of public humanities in these critical times, both in the public sphere and in the context of higher education. Today, we will explore a particularly emerging media, audio, for a panel that we have titled Audio, Media, and New Directions in the Humanities. It is the first of 2 back-to-back sessions on audio and podcast, led by our fellows Milan Terlunen and Olivia Branscoon. We thought that the times called for a rather deep dive on such a topic, particularly as many of us are rethinking our teaching, our research, and our public humanities projects within the confines of a lockdown or in a domestic reality that has, however, called new attention to virtual forms of communication. In fact, one of the ideas or the themes that has been running throughout our meetings in the course of the year, but has become more urgent lately, has been on the ways in which, the methods and the approaches and the challenges that many of you have been dealing with in developing your projects of public humanities, developing media and models of communication to build and nurture expanded publics. All of these challenges have much to teach the humanities and higher education at large in our current conditions and in our future challenges. Many of the decisions that you have made and for your projects, and many of the challenges that you have solved on how to teach in prisons, how to produce a scholarly podcast, or give curatorial agency to underrepresented youth are now the new norm, rather than the exception that you once perhaps consider yourselves to be in academic contexts. And I think that this is going to be a crucial aspect of public humanities, of the field of public humanities. I'm going to introduce you to our fellows leaders today and their guests, but first I want to explain a little bit of the format. Briefly, we're all in a Zoom meeting, so bear that in mind because you should be seeable in the grid out there. We ask, however, we have as hosts, we have muted everybody, and we ask that you remain muted during the presentations of the fellows and their guests, and perhaps it's best also that you turn off your camera during their presentation. But please, please turn it back on for the Q&A so that we can construe a sense of collective or community, however gridded. If you want to participate in the Q&A, and I hope that you will, we offer several options. One is that you digitally raise your hand, and you can see the digital raise hand option in the participant toolbar on Zoom, and then we'll call on you to ask questions yourselves. Or you can field questions through the chat function for everyone else to see. You can also use the chat function if in the course of the conversation, references, web pages, or other sources come to mind that you just want to put in there, because these will be a record of the conversation for all of us, especially for Milan and Olivia, as they go back at this meeting and they think of their own work and of your feedback. We'll moderate a discussion towards the end, and we plan the whole event to last a little less than an hour. So today our fellow presenters are Milan Terlunen and Olivia Branscoon. Milan is a student in the literature department, or English and comparative literature department. Yes, where he studies British, French, and German literature and looks at the history of the plot twist in the 19th century. Olivia is a graduate, sorry, I'm going to admit a couple of people. Olivia is a graduate student at the philosophy department, working on early modern and medieval thinkers as they explain situations where the boundaries between people and objects get blurred. She's particularly interested in the interaction of objects, images, written and spoken words. Somewhat fittingly for these two, they both have worked for some time in producing How to Read, of which Milan is a co-creator and a host, and is a very popular podcast featuring literary scholars, and I think we'll hear more about How to Read today. Together, they joined the SOF Heyman with a project that looked to redefine the podcast as a more civically embedded medium and use it for public building in the context of the city. So their question initially was how to bring an oral media into the context of the public reality of the city. Today, they will discuss the use of audio media broadly in the humanities, and next week we will delve more specifically on this public humanities project and how the making process of podcasting provides its own form of public and scholarly research. Their guests today include Michelle Wilson and Sierra Eckert. Michelle is the digital publishing librarian here at Columbia, where she runs a multitude of fascinating projects on digital humanities, including the Digital Publishing Workshop, and she also runs a podcast club. She has been a stupendous, amazing resource for all of us throughout the year, and I'm so thankful, Michelle, for you being a constant friend of the Public Humanities program. Sierra Eckerd is a doctoral candidate in English and comparative literature at Columbia University, and she's a rapporteur of the university's seminar in material texts. And she comes to us today, among other things, as someone who has been using audio media in her teaching for some time, even pre-COVID, if I may, including How to Read. So it will be great to hear from all of these different perspectives and to hear questions and comments from everyone as we continue to shape the emerging and urgent field of public humanities. With that, I am going to pass the grid on to Milan. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Maria. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So I am going to now share my screen, and I ask in advance that you don't judge me for the number of tabs that I have open. But there we go. So, yeah, so today we're talking about audio media and new orientations for the humanities. And we wanted to begin, Olivia and I, by just sharing with you some of the experiences that we've gained through doing this podcast for several years now, and what that might have to offer now in this time of lockdown, for us as teachers, for us as scholars, and that can be a start for a broader conversation. So, a little overview. I guess I realize now, Olivia, we didn't decide who was going to talk about what. So, where should we start? Do you want to jump straight into the first topic?
Sure. So, typically when we think about audio and sound in academia, it comes in the form of the unmediated sound that we encounter in lectures and seminar discussions or conferences. Audio communication through sound is super common in academic communication, especially in humanities communication. But we don't think so much about the mediated sort of versions of audio communication. And what we're going to talk about today, for the most part, is sort of how thinking about the mediated side of audio, or what audio media can help us like just think about humanities communication using audio more broadly. So to use the terminology of digital pedagogy, we tend to think of audio as mostly being synchronous. So that would be like, you know, you're in the room listening to somebody give a talk, you're in a lecture hall listening to a professor. But audio media gives us access to points of intervention that are both synchronous or in the room and asynchronous, so through the editing process. And through our podcasting work, we've developed a whole range of both synchronous and asynchronous strategies for communicating scholarly ideas through audio. And we'd like to share some of those with you as a way to sort of think through how to communicate effectively using audio for teaching and also other scholarly purposes.
Yeah, I hope the terms synchronous and asynchronous are familiar to quite a few people. I feel like there've been a lot of emails going around in the last couple of months, you know, as we're all shifting to teaching, right? Like the synchronous teaching of like live Zoom conversations, and then all the asynchronous things that we do when we're not face to face through a screen with our students. All right, so, oops. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just to kind of give a little introduction to the podcast. So the name is How to Read, and it started in 2016, and with a kind of primarily literary focus, because that's my background. But in the last couple of years, and especially with Olivia's involvement as a philosopher, we've really wanted to kind of move into covering the humanities more broadly, so people from disciplines other than literary studies. And the core features of this podcast, what set it apart from others, is first of all, the episodes are really short, so these bite-sized 15-minute conversations between me and a different scholar each time, talking about a current research project of theirs, sometimes research that they've published, sometimes work in progress, and aimed at an audience with no prior knowledge and no particular academic background, so we don't assume any kind of specialist knowledge, or that, you know, people have experience of university level classes. And yeah, I think that's about all we need to say for the purposes of this initial presentation. So should we jump ahead? Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about my role. So we wanted to kind of structure this presentation to talk first about the synchronous strategies that we've developed. So these are the things that happen in the room when we are with our guest that we're interviewing. And then we're going to move on to talking about the asynchronous ones next. So as I already said, my role is as the interviewer or host. And so I am playing the role of someone with no prior knowledge, which is a very empowering role to play, I will say. You know, actually we do a lot of preparation and research beforehand that we will talk about next week. But for the purposes of the interview and as far as guests are concerned, I'm coming to this thing totally fresh. And what that means in practice is that, like, if I hear technical language, you know, jargon specific to different disciplines, I will always ask for a definition or an explanation. And we tell guests, like, technical terms are fine, but we will ask you to define them. And so that's just a kind of reflex that I've developed. But also just like saying when I feel confused is something that I've become increasingly comfortable doing through this podcast. And yeah, just kind of, if a guest is maybe pitching it at a too kind of scholarly level, that I feel like there's too much information coming to me all at once, just to kind of slow them down and be like, whoa, 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 spell that out, say that again, go slower. That is something that we've increasingly discovered the value of, and I think we'll come back to that again when we talk about editing. And also just sometimes like the value of repeating key phrases. Like if I hear a guest say something that seems like particularly important, then even just kind of saying it aloud again, I think that there's a value there for the guest in kind of helping to solidify their key idea, but also then for listeners, just to kind of have some time to really like process and, you know, to know that there is an emphasis on those ideas that are immediately repeated. I think that's all I was going to say about that.
Yeah, so while that's all happening, I'm listening closely and sort of just taking notes on things that I want to ask the guest, or in some cases Milan, to return to at the end of the recorded interview. So we keep the recorder running, and sometimes I'll say, okay, you kind of touched on this person, but you like just said, for instance, you just say Descartes. What if people don't know who Descartes is? So can you rephrase the question? Or rephrase your response to the question saying, you know, René Descartes, 17th century philosopher, something along those lines. And a few times actually in editing, we've been like really thankful that we had these sort of expansions on things mentioned in the course of the conversation. And it's really helpful to have somebody listening in who's not actively thinking about how to respond or sort of processing ideas that the guest brings up. And it also helps that this sort of like searching for missing definitions or connections is kind of like a quintessential philosophical skill that I'm also working on developing in other contexts. So it's something that we've made kind of more and more part of the recording process that allows us to have a bit of extra information that we can incorporate when we get to the asynchronous phase, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But those are the two things that, or Milan is doing a lot of other things while that's going on, but those are sort of the two like roles that are being filled in the recorded interview process. So like in the synchronous in-room part of our recording. But we also have a bunch of strategies that we've developed that we try to build into the conversation in the moment. Milan, do you want to start talking about a couple of those?
Sure, I would love to talk about the tea, which is something that I think listeners often comment on and like, I hope. So we have a little portable tea set. We take it to every interview. We're usually interviewing people in their offices. So we have like a complete tea set that we can just take and set up and serve tea from a teapot to our guests. And it's kind of like, I don't know, it's a little bit cutesy, but it is also, it came out of like a genuine sense of awkwardness that I had early on, and just by coincidence one time had a cup of tea in front of me when I was interviewing someone and realized that it gave me something to do with my hands, and that when you're sitting opposite someone and you've got these two microphones between you, and so you're quite kind of like your heads are fixed opposite each other, it can just feel awkward. And so having that tea there made me feel less awkward, which is good. Maybe sometimes makes the guest feel less awkward, which is also good. And it is also a brilliant strategy for interrupting guests without making it feel rude. So, you know, the finished episode is 15 minutes, we usually interview for about 35 to 40. That's still really compressed amount of time. So the tea is a way that, you know, if people are sort of rambling, I don't know how to say this more charitably, but, you know, if we notice the guest has been talking for a long time and not giving me room to kind of interject, then offering them some more tea is just a very like smooth way to keep the conversation going rather than it becoming a monologue.
It's also a really nice way when we get to the editing phase to be able to include content that's not quite as developed, using the tea as like a transitional moment to say, like, you know, someone might trail off a little bit and then we can insert the tea so that it sounds more natural in the recording.
Yeah, so when it comes to the edit, we often move the moment where I'm actually pouring tea away from when it really happened to a kind of convenient point of punctuation within the kind of the flow of the interview, but we'll come back to that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of like quirky examples and jokes?
Yeah, so one of our goals is for the final product, the final edited interview to sound spontaneous and organic while also being like pretty clear and self-contained in 15 minutes. So that's kind of a lot to ask of a scholarly interview, and also of us being there in the room in the moment trying to make that all happen. And one strategy that we have to facilitate that is coming up in advance with some sort of like jokes or examples from our personal lives that we can insert in like a seemingly spontaneous way. Of course, Milan and I know in advance that we have kind of like an arsenal of these, but the hope is that we can get a moment of laughter or sort of unexpected energy and connection between Milan and the guest. And that really sort of transitions into thinking about our asynchronous process though, because it's in a way kind of like a pre-interview asynchronous element. So should we take that as an opportunity to transition to the asynchronous editing strategies that we want to talk about?
Yeah, oops, that's too far. Now, how do I make this go back? Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so we're not going to talk today a lot about what we do before the interview. We do a lot, but that I think we decided made more sense to talk about next week under the rubric of research. But one of the things that we do in preparation is preparing a bunch of like jokes and quirky examples and anecdotes just to kind of have them ready to go if they feel right in the interview. But yeah, so today we're focusing more on the editing phase. So after we've recorded the audio, the strategies that we've developed at that stage. Yeah, and just to say off the bat, like our strategies have shifted a lot over the years, and especially in the last year. And I think it's partly because of the Public Humanities Fellowship and the thinking that we've done there for the project that we're doing, which we'll talk about a little bit. But yeah, we've shifted a lot over the years. And I think, Olivia, do you want to talk about embodiment? Because you phrased it so nicely earlier.
Yeah, so like I just said, we're trying to balance clarity and accessibility, or sort of ease of grasping the concepts, which are often quite complex and sophisticated, with a sense of, you know, sort of friendliness or humanization. One of the reasons why we were both interested in pursuing a project like what the podcast offers is because we wanted to have more experiences like that in academia. And we wanted to show people who aren't academics or who aren't part of the sort of professional scholarly world that those warm, you know, human interactions are very much a part of academic life and are something that can be accessible to a lot of people. So initially, the way that we thought about handling clarity was through sort of moving away from disfluencies or discontinuities in people's speech. In some ways, it ended up leading to this like disembodied sound where we were getting rid of the ambient noise. We were getting rid of ums and ahs, or people saying like, oh, wait, I need to go back and rephrase that. But what we realized...
And I used to say to guests, like, we'll make you sound superhuman, right? Which is appealing, I think, to a lot of scholars that, you know, if they're anxious about being recorded, having their voice be put out there, they could listen to some of our early episodes and be like, oh, I'm going to sound as superhuman as that. But
well, one thing that we realized, I mean, we realized a couple of things. So for one, that editing strategy in some ways conflicted with our sort of the goal of the podcast, which was to make scholarly ideas accessible. So even if we thought that we were making them super clear by doing that, we were also making it seem like you have to be a superhuman to be a scholar, or you have to be capable of this like perfect sort of like comprehensive clarity just off the cuff, like, you know, you're the Roman orator or something, like par excellence, to like be a scholar. And that was not what we were going for. And we also realized that not only that, but just like as a matter of sort of psychology, it might not be as accessible as we thought to get rid of things like ums, ahs, pauses that were just a natural part of the rhythms of people's speech. So we kind of changed our editing strategies and methods to keep that more embodied, humanizing set of sounds in the final product.
yeah, and I mean, there's sort of three categories that we've come up with that I think are kind of big ways that we've tried to achieve that. So firstly, it's just like any moments of like high energy or laughter, right? Like we try and tell jokes, we try and kind of like create some kind of like, yeah, energy or enthusiasm in the conversation. We'll almost always put those in, even if they're not always quite fitting in terms of content. Like we want energy, we want laughter, we want enthusiasm. We've also really shifted our practice in terms of pauses. So initially, we were really kind of micromanaging sentences to make the rhythms of people's speech as clear as possible as we saw it. So like that the rhythm would mimic the syntax of the sentence they were saying. Now what we tend to do is really just put in pauses for listeners to think. So scholars, because they're experts and they know it all, they want to keep talking, and that's fine in the room, but then we will put in pauses just to kind of give thinking time for listeners, but leave the actual speech pretty much the natural rhythm. And then the third is like non-verbal sounds, so like ums and ahs and hesitations and rephrasing. That used to be something we mostly edit out entirely. Now we largely leave it in. So if it's making it harder to understand, we might edit, but mostly we just leave it in because actually that's how real people speak, including these non-superhuman academics.
Yeah, another element that I like alluded to when I was talking about bringing embodiment back was getting rid of ambient noise. So although we did have tea, which we always made sure to record, we always make sure to record, which allowed for there to be kind of a level of artificial ambient noise in the final product of the edited episode. For a lot of our process, we've been really trying to get rid of things like sirens or bells in the background, or like one time we were doing an interview in the philosophy department at Yale, which is in a very old building, very poorly insulated building, and we kept having to stop because we could hear undergrads like playing football on the quad outside so clearly on the audio. But one thing that we've been thinking a lot about, especially in the context of our public humanities fellowship, is sort of bringing the environment back as well. And how does ambient noise, or sort of allowing the space to be heard, enrich the kind of communication that we can do using audio or podcast as a medium? Milan, do you want to talk a bit about where we see this heading?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the project that we were in the process of getting off the ground before all of the lockdown happened was the idea of doing a walking dialogue, having a walking dialogue with a scholar around Harlem. And we'd focused it down to scholar Derek McQueen, who is also a pastor of a local church. And our idea was to talk with him both inside a series of churches, but also walking between them, so that we could both stand physically within these churches and like talk about them and relate that to his theological interests, but then also be on the street walking between them and record that as well. And so that hasn't happened yet. We really hope it will at some point. But for us, it became a really appealing thing to think about like the sound of the interiors of churches, right? Like voices echo in different ways, voices sound different on the street, and that would really be a feature of that interview in a way that it hasn't been so far.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about making podcasting as a medium something that's also engaging with the public or the city more directly, I mean, I'm still in New York now, and the ambient soundscape has changed so much in the last couple of months. It's amazing how different it is. And even thinking about sort of the rise and fall, if it's even really fair to call it that, but sort of the, like, I guess I'll say instead, like the contours of the pandemic in the city, like even just hearing, you know, ambulances and sirens on the street, I feel like there was a peak of that, and it's now started to, at least in my neighborhood, taper off a little bit. So that background soundscape is such a big part of how we like tap into what's going on in the city, as people living in New York and living in this particular neighborhood. And so we were thinking about ways to convey that and express that in the podcasting medium. As Milan said, it's on pause for now, but we hope to be able to do it soon.
The other possible development of this project, or of the Public Humanities Fellowship year, is we're trying to find scholars who might be willing to talk to us on video from inside their own homes at the moment. And we're particularly thinking about the sort of domestic spaces, like kitchens or bathrooms, and looking for scholars who work on topics related to like food or hygiene, who might actually then want to talk to us from those spaces. So yeah, finding ways to like make the place where the interview happens really relevant and palpable within the interview. Mm-hmm. I think in the interest of time, should we skip the blurb? I feel like I'd like to just get to other people.
Great.
But yeah, so just our conclusion as we were thinking about the strategies we've developed is just how much there is a feedback loop between the synchronous and the asynchronous strategies, that often we've developed a strategy on the one side in order to compensate for something that we struggled with on the other side. So like having jokes in the room is because we realized we wanted more energy in certain interviews, or I'm trying to think of other examples.
Well, having, you know, me listen in and do those clarifying questions at the end, or asking for definitions, or specifically, I mean, I remember one time we realized that we didn't have, I can't remember whose name it was right now. It wasn't Eckert, but there was someone's name that we like only had as a last name in a recorded interview. And we realized like, oh, next time we need to make sure that we ask for first and last names when people bring up a figure who like maybe in their field is super, super well known, but to somebody who's not an expert, they might not know off the top of their head who this person is.
Yeah, all right. Well, so hopefully we can now open it up to other people. But for us, the bigger picture here is that the strategies we've developed through the podcast are a way to start thinking about effective communication in the humanities. We certainly feel like it's worth scholars of all kinds experimenting with the affordances of audio media. I think that's something that scholars have sometimes been kind of anxious about, the idea that you could record a lecture, record a talk that they've given, what happens to it afterwards. But so to think about that not as like a threat, but as an affordance of the medium of recorded audio.
There's so much, thank you, Milan. On the spirit of the scholars using audio on their teaching, I have so many questions for that. I'm sure others do as well. But I'd like to give an opportunity to Sierra and Michelle to talk about their own experience. Sierra, from the perspective of having used this How to Read podcast, in her teaching. And Michelle, just perhaps summarizing a little bit some of the resources that you made available at the library to explore these and other issues. I'm particularly fascinated by this question of the how to capture the public orally by just, capture the sound of a space, which is to capture the sound of a particular public. I think that's an amazing development of your thinking of audio media. But yeah, so perhaps we can start with Sierra, just to hold in your last comment, Milan, on the use that teachers are doing with audio media.
Thank you. Just to sort of pick up on this question, I began teaching with How to Read as a podcast actually before the pandemic. This past year, I've been teaching in the core curriculum at Columbia in literature humanities, and one of the texts that I chose to add as an instructor for the optional text was a text called Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies, which was written by a writer, translator, political advisor, Renaissance woman in 14th and 15th century France. And the fifth episode, I think a fairly early episode in How to Read as a podcast, is an interview between Milan and Julie Crawford, the former head of literature humanities and a professor in the Department of English here. And I was interested in having my students listen to this podcast, not only just for the sort of background on the debates around women as writers, but also the political context in which this text can be read as a work of philosophy. The bulk of that interview in the podcast on the politics of disobedient wives, I think is the title of it, is about the querelle des femmes, this debate in sort of continental Europe at the time about the role of women and the family in larger debates about the body politic. And so I was interested in having my students have this context in the back of their head before going into this text. But I also wanted them to hear it as a model for conversation about a literary text. This was sort of halfway through the spring semester. I wanted them to hear Milan's jokes with Julie Crawford at the very end about her own personal life. And I wanted them at a meta level to think about modeling the kind of questions that they could ask about a text that a scholar is asking in a more accessible and more public manner. So the way that I structured my assignment is that I had my students listen to the interview with Julie Crawford, come up with a question that they would want to ask Julie that Milan hadn't yet asked, and then read City of Ladies and ask another question, having read the text and listened to the podcast that they have in mind. And that produced some really generative conversations in our classroom that I think allowed students to reflect even on the manner in which you ask academic questions. So that was something that I was really pleased to see in the classroom. I didn't anticipate using audio to the degree to which I think I had to think about when the pandemic happened. I normally do a lot of reading aloud in the classroom. I think that's a really important tool for getting students in dialogue with a text in a very low stakes way, often in a round robin. So I'll have my seminar read around in a round robin. You can't do that on Zoom. And so that was one of the challenges that I've been thinking about teaching this past semester. How do you teach a text thinking about the texture of language without getting into the challenges that a mediated format like Zoom presents? So I had my students work with a recording of Gertrude Stein reading a text as a way into one of the more difficult texts on the spring semester Lit-Hum syllabus, where they're reading Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which is a text that I often will teach by way of other mediums like visual art, or often the sort of other developments in sort of modernist writing in the middle of the sort of early parts of the 20th century. I like to introduce the sort of defamiliarizing genres, what happens to language in the wake of war, what happens to visual art in the wake of the Great War. And so I would normally have students read aloud a passage of another modernist writer to get the texture of that language in their heads. And so I came up with a sort of modified strategy where I would have my students listen to a recording of Stein sort of full of the ambient noise of a really old recording from, I think, 1934 on Penn Sounds, and then record themselves using Zoom reading the first 2 paragraphs of To the Lighthouse and sharing that with their small groups of students. And that, I think, it solved some of the problems. It raised other problems that I'm happy to talk about in ways that made me think about Zoom in new ways. But I think it is a sort of challenge in a way that I think we take so much for granted in the sort of physical classroom about the way that we communicate, the role of the voice in the classroom space, that I found, at least I think I wouldn't have thought about in the same way had I not began thinking about this by way of Milan's recommendation about Julie Crawford's interview on how to read. So it's something that I'm thinking about in my own teaching. It's something that I think I'm continuing to think about, and I would love to hear some of the resources that Michelle, it sounds like you've been developing as well.
That assignment sounds awesome. I wish I was in your Zoom class.
So I'm the digital publishing librarian in the digital scholarship division at the libraries, and my position was created a few years ago to support the expansion of a digital scholarship program that would offer sort of a suite of services to students and faculty and staff who wanted to create digital projects. So I came into this role with sort of an established journals program, which we still run. But since I've been here, I've wanted to develop other service models and technologies that will allow people to what we describe even on our website as play a bit more and sort of explore different ways to make content more openly available while recognizing that there are challenges to using new technologies, even from trying to get recognition for using different technologies and different kinds of publications to how do we preserve those objects and how do we make them discoverable and usable by the public and by other researchers. So some of the new services that we've offered, including things like Scalar to allow people to build digital books and digital exhibitions, and also the podcasting program that I began about a year ago, have been heavily education centered. So one of the things that we don't just want people to do is just come into the library and borrow a microphone. We wanted all of our programs to be focused a lot more on thinking about the methodology that you use to communicate using new digital tools. So having people come into the library to do, to borrow materials would mean that they'd need to attend orientations or come to workshops or participate as students in our podcast club. And so on day one, we don't take out microphones. We talk about what makes a good piece of scholarship and what makes a good podcast, and sort of find where there are things that align and spaces where there are tension between those two in a podcast club and in the workshops that I run around podcasting. And so we think a lot about what Milan and Olivia have spoken about, which is the sort of style of language and a need to have more of elements of surprise and things that are not quite so mediated and so smoothed out in order to communicate with a public audience, and sort of talk about the intimacy and the personalness of having someone in your ear speaking to you, and how realizing that that there are differences in the way that people are listening and are taking in and digesting your content through the audio medium means that you need to change the way that you're communicating with them. And so we've been thinking a lot about and partnering with people around campus to create educational programming around podcasting that doesn't just talk about the technical aspects of it, but about using it as a tool to reach new audiences and also to find new ways to communicate and to find ways that are more universal and less discipline specific to the language and the communication style that we use. This also, we talked a lot about how we can use the systems that we use within the library to communicate and make research available and discoverable for people who are using things like library catalogs and Google Scholar and different ways of traditionally finding research applicable to new media types, and also about how we can teach people, as we are sort of teaching people digital literacy and research methodologies, to search out new forms of media and incorporate and understand how to cite those kinds of media in their research to sort of validate or maybe blur the lines between what's considered sort of like an official citable source and what's something that is just part of like entertainment media, and how we can through the like information literacy programs that we have at the library sort of push those things forward or challenge students to think about those things when they're doing their research.
It's something, thank you, Michelle and Sarah, this was great insight. Something that it's very interesting that you pointed out, Michelle and Sarah, on a way you did as well, like the introduction of this format or new medias in the teaching and in the research, require also new protocols, like how do you include them in the syllabus? How do you consider them peer reviewed at one level or another? How do they make them searchable? That go hand by hand in our challenges as in the public humanities to producing the content itself. Also develop and talk about the protocols by which we introduce these new scholarly documents or public documents, in our documents. So thank you everyone for making yourself public. To all of us, we're all excited about questions, but also about just comments, feedbacks to the project, or kind of responses for the time that we have left. Do we have any digital hand raised? I know Eileen Giluli has a question.
Thanks, Maria, and thank you all. This is really fascinating. And I was just looking at the chat function, and I guess it was Milan saying about if he had known about Michelle's resources from the beginning, how much that would have changed the project. So part of what is exciting to me about this is this the sharing of projects and resources and possibilities for collaboration and just tool sharing, I think, which is, really part of now our Zoom world, will be really important. But I had a couple of questions for Milan and Olivia. One was I wanted you to talk a bit more about writing and recording the blurb, which you didn't have time to talk about in the presentation. And the other question is, I'm curious about, you mentioned about your jokes, right? That you always, and you mentioned a couple times that you have an example of one or jokes that you have an arsenal of. So I wanted you to give us a couple of those jokes, right? And whether, are they, I assume sometimes they break the ice, but how else do they sort of get incorporated into the production of your podcast?
Do you want to talk about the blurb and I'll talk about the jokes?
Sure. So the blurb is something that when we publish the final sort of product of the podcast exists both in recorded and written form. So it's the written introduction to the episode that one of us will read, and we'll record that and have it kind of at the beginning of the 15-minute segment. And it's always less than 100 words. I don't know if we've ever let ourselves go over 100 words. I'm sure it's happened, but usually we try to keep it under 100 words. And it's one of the most time-consuming things that we do because it really is. So figuring out how to...
So here's some examples. I'm just putting them up on the screen. So these are the blurbs.
Yeah, so that's what I meant when I said it exists in written form. So people can access it when they go to the website to see our past episodes. And it's one of the most time-consuming things that we do because we're trying to give a fair overview of what happens in the episode that's also listenable, makes sense in a recorded format, not too jargony, not too dense, but also compelling. And one thing that we've started doing as we write the blurbs is thinking about key words or sort of key terms that emerged over the course of the editing process and trying to kind of seed them for listeners in the blurb. to sort of prime them to hear these like key ideas that we think really help with what we sometimes think of as like the narrative arc of the podcast, even though obviously for the most part these are nonfiction, it's somewhat scholarly research. We still think often there's like a story that's being told that's captured in the podcast once it's been edited and beforehand. And that's another sort of element of our process of the asynchronous editing that's become more sort of prominent as we thought about the synchronous asynchronous distinction, because to the listener, those key terms are presented before they ever like encounter the episode itself. But for us, like these only really become apparent as key terms once we've listened to the full 45 minutes to an hour, figured out how to condense it to 15 minutes, and so on. So that is, in a nutshell, I think, what the blurb is supposed to do, and also what our process for it is. But yeah, it really does take, like, in some cases, days for us to get it into a form that we feel good about. So
yeah, literally hours of work go into those 100 words, but we think it's worth it. And then the jokes, I mean, so it's not that we have a kind of bank of them ready to go for any interview, but we plan specific jokes for each interview, right? So based on the topic, we'll sort of think like, what's the like silliest analogy that we can think of for this concept that they're coming up with? You know, like maybe it's an analogy of like tripping and falling on the street. Maybe it's an analogy of like running and getting sweaty, or like, you know, these things that sort of, yeah, just can kind of lower the tone a bit, and make it something that maybe is more like relatable, more everyday. So yeah, kind of like the silly analogy is definitely one that we try and have some ready to go.
and like pop culture analogies sometimes too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just because we like that, but also because it's more accessible.
Yeah. And like comical misunderstandings, right? So like sometimes I'll be like, when I first thought about this topic, this is what I thought, and kind of like playing up the sort of like comedy of misunderstanding an idea, so that then it allows the guest to kind of laugh with us about that and then be like, but here's how to understand it better.
These are great. I mean, I feel that a lot of what you're talking about today sort of bridges between strategies of just public building through interviewing and then audio producing. And they're both related, but also kind of different aspects of your public humanities work. So much that the interviewing strategies that you're talking about, you know, pertain and can be helpful to many of you who are doing public humanities work, which end product is not necessarily a podcast. You know, the one challenge that we talk through all of the projects in public humanities, and Adam Capitano here can talk more about this. How do you, as a scholar, an academic, build a community and a connection with those to whom, or with communities to whom you don't necessarily belong? I mean, in this case, when you interview scholars, you are part of that community in a way, but the many challenges that we face is to build those connections in communities in which you as a scholar might not necessarily be a part of to begin with. So I feel that these strategies are very useful across the board to many of you. And again, I asked you to ask some questions. I did want to ask you before we move on, as an art historian myself, if you could talk a little bit about the challenges of audio media in the humanities for non-textual, you know, issues and documents. Now, you're talking about engaging with literary scholars, but, you know, how do you produce podcasts around the spaces, images, or with the spaces, images, if at all possible, no? How do you introduce those aspects of history and memory and community building into a podcast?
Well, I always think about sound and like audio and sort of olfactory, so like smell and sound as being kind of related, and that for me personally, at least, they both are very sort of memory laden sensory modalities, where like the particular sound of a space is something that can really trigger a whole bunch of memories that I didn't even realize I was holding on to. when I was an undergraduate, I did a project where I recorded a bunch of museum visits that I did for part of a travel grant, and tried to make like a sound art piece about that. But, you know, whether or not that particular project was successful, I can't really say, probably not. But it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think it's hard. But also, I think it's one of the real sort of like, affordances that audio media offers, like letting some of the background noise, like I just heard a honk outside my window. I don't know if you all did. Like letting some of that background noise be present gives so much setting to a conversation and moves away from this sort of like disembodied, sort of like totally rationalist kind of thinking about the intellect, and lets it be something that's more situated. I don't know, Milan, do you have any?
Yeah, well, I'd also just say, and I wonder if you agree, like, I think in some ways it's easier to do interviews with people who work on non-textual objects, because the temptation to quote at length is not there. Like, we had an interview with Usha Iyer, who's a scholar of film and specifically Indian dance performance in film. And I think like scholars of like film and visual art are really good at verbally describing their objects, whereas literary scholars and scholars who work with text primarily, the temptation is sometimes to quote a very long passage and then to want to discuss it at length, and that does not work for our format. So yeah, in some ways I think actually, audio objects, visual objects, moving images, like that's easier in some ways.
And we have in one instance actually quoted from or excerpted from a movie. So there's a part in one of our episodes where, what is it called? The bad girl? The
Gone Girl.
Well, I know it's from Gone Girl, but there's like a name anyway.
The Cool Girl.
Cool Girl monologue from the movie Gone Girl. But that's interesting because of course, you know, movies sort of quintessentially visual, but in that case we like used an audio quote from it, or just sort of like a textual quote from it in a podcast recording.
The podcast that I do with my students in Podcast Club is called Material Culture. So each of the students or groups of students have an opportunity to interview a librarian or curator about an object in the library's collections. So there's the challenge right there, that they've been given a, you know, three-dimensional object that they have to do a storytelling around. So a lot of our students have found it really wonderful to have the object in the room with them, and their experience and their experience of touching it and getting to be around these objects. I mean, some of them are very old manuscripts or very powerful documents in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library's collections related to slavery, and that their reactions to these objects and their remarks about them as they're handling them and touching them for the first time can really sort of bring you into that space of getting to experience the objects sort of through their reactions, and sometimes the sounds of handling or page turning, but them sort of reacting to it's so much bigger or so much smaller than I thought it would be, or am I allowed to touch it? It looks very fragile, and those kinds of reactions to being with the object can convey that materiality of the objects there. I've also experimented, like Olivia, a little bit in trying to convey with soundscapes or objects or artworks, in particular doing a podcast on Betty Tompkins, who is a feminist artist from the 1970s, who did a recent project called Women Words, where she painted words that she had crowdsourced about women on canvases and sort of lined the walls of a narrow gallery with them. And we had people record the words and layered them over one another so that it recreated the experience of sort of being bombarded by all of these words in the space. So I think that actually having to confront the challenge of being with a visual object in that space and tried to translate the impact of it or what it does to you by being in the presence of that object is a creative challenge, but that sort of trying to convey the feeling or emotion you have of being with that object through the audio medium can help you to sort of understand what it is that you're trying to translate.
Thank you for so brilliantly encapsulating the motivation for my dissertation project, which is about what artworks do, what art objects do to people. But yeah, I mean, I think like thinking about it as describing, like it's not just about, just description doesn't always do the trick. Like there needs to be another element of like a sense of conveying the encounter. And yeah, I think those are great examples.
I'm unmuting myself and I'm going to do the offering of the tea strategy. Not because anyone is rambling, but because we're hitting our hour mark. So to sort of start to wrapping it up, the good news is that next week we're going to pick up on some of this conversation on podcast. So between now and then, I ask everyone that, you know, gather more thoughts about podcasting and bring them up next week. I am very excited to see all of our fellows from this year, which again, we'll be presenting in the next few weeks. I'm going to share our beautiful poster again so that you have that there, but I'm also seeing in the grid some of our upcoming fellows and some of new friends to the Public Humanities program. So I hope that you keep coming, and I hope that some of the things that we raised today will keep coming back in the next of the few weeks. So by the end of our series, we will all have a better understanding of everyone's projects. We'll all be able to sort of forward them a little bit more, you know, and share the questions. So with these, I'm going to summon you for next week, podcast as research with both the same guests. And then in the coming weeks, we're going to have Scott McFarlane on walking and mapping, Alessandra Mendez, the Multilingual Youth as curators, Erin and Meth on their experiments on Maeve, right? Yes. On their experiments and experiences on pedagogies in justice, and Akua Bamful on her pedagogies in climate. So tune in next Wednesday at 4. We're going to be using the same Zoom link. And with that, I really want to everyone join together. Thank you, Olivia, Milan, Sierra, and Michelle, and everyone for joining us today. And see you next week.